let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the podcast where we talk about gaining, feedism, and everything in its orbit. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. So James, what are we talking about?
Today, listen, we've got another special episode for you listeners, everybody. We are celebrating 40 years of Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, which, while as a whole, I wouldn't say is an iconic film, this is the Monty Python film with the one and only Mr Creosote, so that, I think, determines its celebration.
Its relevance.
Its relevance, certainly. I mean, for anyone who hasn't seen it, Mr Creosote is a very, very fat man who eats so much that he explodes. And much like how Violet Beauregarde is the inception of the blueberry fetish, I believe Mr. Creosote is the inception of the exploding belly fetish.
Possibly. I don't know if there were any other examples in film prior to that specifically ended in an explosion. But the wave of like that effect being used again and again in sort of like B-grade horror films or B-grade action films, like that trope definitely got reused.
Yeah, 100%. I've never sat down and watched Slither, though I am aware of a scene where that happens. And when we get around to doing a Halloween special, Mama's gonna have to sit down and finally fucking watch it. So
You'll actually watch that one?
for our horror special, yes.
Oh, yay, because I haven't really gotten you to watch a horror movie yet. So like that one, I mean, in terms of like, it's a lot of body horror. It's a lot of like gross out body horror, like Lovecraftian type of stuff.
Yeah, no, it sounds terrible, but you know what? I'm committing for the podcast, for the people, so, you know, probably not going to be this year, kids, but, you know, at some stage in the future, we'll do a Halloween thing and I'll watch it for your listening pleasure. You can deal with my trauma, but we're not talking about Slither today. We are talking about Mr. Creosote. So, Tim, you're an old bitch.
Yeah.
Yes. You were well established in the world when this movie first came. No, you were born.
I think that when did it come out? 84? 85?
Well, hang on. 40,
Or was it even earlier? It might have been even earlier.
No, 83, because it's 40,
it came out the year I was born.
Because 40 years.
Yes. Okay.
There you go.
I can't do simple math. Yes, it came out the year I was born, okay?
There you go.
But I mean, I don't think I saw it properly until I was like 10 or 11.
Makes sense. Anyways, 40 years of. So you saw it when you were about 10. What was your impression of, before we get into the scene, what was your impression of the movie overall?
Well, around 10, a friend of mine who watched a lot of British comedy got me into Monty Python. Like, he was like, have you ever heard of them before? He had like this is back when we had cassette tapes. He had like a cassette tape of just skits, songs, you know, things that they had done that had been made famous. And I got into it in a big way. So first he brought over The Holy Grail. We watched that. Then The Life of Brian. And then finally, I don't think I watched this with him. I think I just happened to catch this on HBO or something. And I really like British humor. I mean, I may not have understood absolutely every reference that they made because I was a child. And I was a child living in the United States, not London. But I loved it. Like, I loved their sense of humor, how dry everything was, how witty everything was, how you kind of had to know some world history to get the jokes. And I loved John Cleese as an actor, still do. Yeah, so I mean, I really loved the movie. And then that scene came along. And this was like at a point in my life where I was pre-puberty, but I knew that I liked the sight of bellies. I knew that I liked things that, like, bits of media that involved them growing, getting bigger, bursting out of clothing, stuff like that. So this scene came along, and in the first moments of, when he's done gorging himself. He's just like, I've had enough. I can't have any more. And then John Cleese comes in, oh, just a wafer thin mint, sir. Just a wafer thin mint. And then, like within the first couple of seconds of him taking that last bite, like we see him expanding. Like his belly keeps growing larger and larger to the point of actually knocking the table over. And then we get the big explosion, and that's kind of where it totally lost me. I was like,
Mm. I mean, I remember being introduced to Monty Python. One of the girls I was friends with in high school, her parents, funny enough, her dad was the principal of our school. I remember that. But her parents owned this massive house. They had a cinema room, which means it was custom built with inbuilt sofas, the dimmable lights, the TV built into the wall with every available streaming and DVD and HDMI option that you could have had back in 2007. But I remember being introduced to Monty Python through them because they had the Ministry of Silly Walks as an illustration mounted on the wall, and they had all sorts, really. So that was a lot of fun, and being introduced to it through that metric. And I think much like yourself, I'd seen Holy Grail, Life of Brian before seeing
Meaning of Life.
Meaning of Life. Sorry, completely spaced on the name
It's
of it.
okay.
Life of Brian, Meaning of Life.
Yeah.
When Life Gives You Lemons. Lemon was a contestant on Canada's Drag Race season 1 of.
So is this how your brain works? Is this where all the connections like eventually lead?
Yeah, people
Okay.
normally
You've explained to me how your brain works, but this is like the best like illustration of how your brain works you've given me.
Yeah, it's very degrees of separation, right? So Monty Python, Meaning of Life, Life of Brian, Brian from Family Guy, Guy, the character of that movie that Ryan Reynolds was in. The Reynolds pamphlet was the song in Hamilton. The Hamilton, Ontario. Ontario is a state in Canada. Canada's Drag Race season 1.
Girl, I love you, but this sounds exhausting.
Welcome to my brain. But it's why I'm able to come out with like fully fledged thoughts, much like having today's discussion to bring it back around to the episode. So watching The Meaning of Life was very interesting because it was the first example of kind of like vignette viewing, because they'd apparently had like a TV show back in the 70s. They'd done all sorts. So it was kind of the first instance of really seeing like, oh, skits, scats, and just little moments kind of clumped together rather than like one fluid story. So when I think about Mr. Creosote, his scene is so singular, but in the wider narrative of the film, it's one of several moments that kind of like parodies the notion of like the coming into of life and the exiting of life. So of course, one of the
because I think the section in which his skit appears is called the autumn years, which is like, dealing with old age and death. Although I don't remember most of the skits dealing with either of those concepts, except for his and the two leaves on the tree that like, you remember that animation? About like one of them, like one of the leaves commits suicide. Everyone goes after it. Like
it's very random, but. One of the more famous scenes in the film, of course, is a fantastic song called Every Sperm is Sacred. And this kicks off the film because, of course, we're talking about birth. But it was high camp and it was high entertainment. So I think kind of similar to what you were saying, you need a little bit of history, a little bit of knowledge to kind of like get into the humor and the vibe of what British and Australian comedy as well, to an extent, what they do try to do. But his was very interesting because it was a camp approach to the ideas of the things that could theoretically lead to our death. So Mr. Creosote as a character is clearly very grumpy, very unhappy, and also extremely fat. If you've never seen it, Google an image, you will be gagged. The man's huge. And his whole character plot point is just, what do you want to eat from the menu? Everything.
I'll have the lot.
And that's another point. He's obviously dressed because it's a fancy restaurant. Everyone, of course, with their fine manners and sitting, of course, lovingly dining on lovely food. And then you've got Commodore Sauce, don't even give shit, go on, give us the lot. Like, it's a
You know,
start.
the only thing that really bothers me about that scene is all the puking. Like, why did he have to start puking constantly? It's like he sits down, he throws up. He talks to somebody for a second, he throws up again. It's like, what was the point of all the vomiting?
Well, one, perhaps it was a metaphation fetish. Someone who's sexually into vomiting. I don't know. I never question these things anymore. It just appears in our media and we go, do we like it? Do we not? We move on. But perhaps it was a representation of truly just the insanity of pure gluttony. The idea that you will just eat until you're full. There's still food on the table, so I guess I'll just vomit. And at first, he just vomits onto the floor because there's no bucket. Fetch the soda bucket.
A bucket for monsieur.
Too late. All over the floor. And then there's a woman and she's trying to mop up.
Oh yeah, a
And then
poor woman.
vomits on the back of her head, and like when he's like covered in vomit, like down the front of him, then he starts eating again. He's like, "Oh, I'm too full." And then there's the scene. Was it like a little thin mint, just a little thin mint? And then he has it, and that's when you hear the rumbling and the table shaking like it's Jurassic Bloody Park. And then he explodes, and there's in 80s style quality effects, so gruesome but kind of basic. You kind of see the cavity of what remains of him, and I think he swallows something, and using special effects to make it look like it slides down his esophagus.
Well, they had like his rib cage exposed, and like you could see his heart beating. I mean, obviously it was just a piece of latex rubber that they were like blowing up with a straw, but
but it was camp. It was entertaining. But that stood out to me as part of the film, kind of on a commentary on life and death. Neither you or I are people who are into the explosive fetishist end of narrative.
No, not personally. It's not really my thing.
But as a character, I can appreciate, what some people may find attractive about a Mr. Creosote, pre-pop. They love that he is so ostensibly huge and yet dressed in all of the finery, no matter what his personality and character is like. You can't deny the man, he looks the part, give him a seat at the table, which ends up being a bench of some description, I think. Consumption to the point of ludicrousy. Does it matter that you have no room? Not really, just make more room. Shit yourself or vomit all over the place. Make a bit of space and cram some more food down you. That's not an uncommon trope, I would argue, in a lot of gainer fantasy. People stuffing to the point of perhaps tipping over. So it doesn't surprise me that there are people who actually get into the whole, actually, yes, let's tip over into
explosion. Yeah.
Explosion or
and I've seen examples in both fiction and art where they do that, but then it's sort of like the person just goes back to normal, just kind of resets everything, which I am a little bit more on board with than the thing that I've always struggled with when it comes to stuffing to the point of explosion is like, well, but in the end of your fantasy, you're dead. And like, I guess I've just always struggled with understanding how death is part of the fantasy.
Well, I suppose this kind of ties in a little bit with death feedism. It's sort of like with death feedism, there's this idea that it's not about focusing on death, but rather the freedom from death. You are so comfortable with the decision to prioritize gaining and the kind of pleasure that it brings you in your life that if it results you in passing away sooner than later, you choose not to feel down about that because you've led a higher quality life for shorter rather than a lower quality of life for longer, which in many ways I don't necessarily disagree with, So I think it's a really interesting commentary on, the absolution of consumption, Maybe from their end of things, they're commenting on our obsession with consumption. From our end of things, it's, God, I want to be so enormously fat that the tension in my body is taut and so stuffed with food that to even eat a single thin mint could possibly cause every part of me to just give way due to my gluttonous greed.
Yeah.
So I can appreciate that. We were talking a little bit about it before, if there were any other examples of explosions. And again, I feel like we've talked about this a little bit, cartoons of the 90s and 80s, Simpsons, Family Guy, Future. I feel like there's got to be episode examples where people explode.
Oh, there are definitely, because while I can't think of anything prior to the film, everything that after the film, yeah, in fact, there was a commercial that is very well known within the gainer sphere It came out in the mid 90s. It was for Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. And they basically just ripped off this entire scene. It was a big fat guy sitting down in a diner, stuffing
Oh
himself
wait,
like over
older
and over and over.
guy, yellow shirt, and he's like,
Yeah,
no more.
yeah.
Oh, I've joked off
It's
that
the same thing. Yeah, it's the same.
many,
And
many,
so have
many
I,
times.
because right up until the explosion point, at least with this particular example, they show his belly expanding. They show the gaps between his buttons getting wider. They show his belt bursting open and his belly becoming a full round sphere. Like all of that was hot as fuck because here's this guy just stuffing himself to the point of bursting out of his clothes. And then again at the very end where he's like, oh, no more, and then like the commercial narrator's like, are you sure you don't have room for another little bonus level? And you see him like take a dollop of whipped cream off of his finger, and then all of a sudden he's like, uh-oh, and explodes all over the diner.
This scene is actually kind of parodied in Ralph Breaks the Internet because he breaks into the internet and there's a scene where he breaks into like some kind of bunny feeding game and he thinks it's adorable to keep feeding the bunny pancakes instead of the healthy food. And the poor bunny is like, oh. And then the bunny eats like one last stack of pancakes and you hear the wobble in the thing and everything. Then it cuts to a scene of a little girl in her car seat who, because it's Disney Pixar, she looks a little bit like a young Moana, I think.
Mhm.
She's playing the game, and then you hear this flash of light and a pop sound, and then she goes, "Ah!" and just starts screaming. So,
And I'll argue that that commercial actually influenced more people than the movie did because they may not know that commercial was ripping off that film, but I think more people of my age saw that commercial than saw this film.
right. I mean, I think it just comes back to that point of interest, like the ways in which a scene in a movie that someone makes as this innocuous reference to life can actually trigger something more sexual in someone else, something more illicit, and then they take that idea and they put it in a TV commercial. Of course, for kids, because where else are you going to get away with putting out that kind of iconography? You don't make it sexual, but again, you repeat the memes and emphasize certain things. The down angles, the popping, the sound, or the stretching sound like a balloon that's ready to snap.
Or just even, when I think about that commercial specifically, I think about the way that they were just tight angled on this incredibly good looking chubby actor,
Oh, yes.
just stuffing his, like, you see him, cramming food, like at one point you actually, like, he's shoving the food into his mouth with
Mhm.
both hands, like it's like it won't fit, and then you see his belt burst open, like, yeah.
Do
For
you know,
people like us, that's like,
a thought comes to me. I wonder if, comparatively speaking, so, and to be fair, I think this is something we can circle back to when we get the chance to hopefully sit down with someone who is into the idea of exploding bellies and that kind of more visceral sense of gainer sexuality, which, of course, if you are, please reach out to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. But the thought that dawns on me is I wonder if this represents the more viscera and the more intentional aspect of gaining in sexuality versus a lot of other gainer kinks, because a lot of those are more subdued and subversive. The idea of wearing tight clothes seemingly by accident. Even in the concept of vor, I've gobbled up a whole person, but you'll never know because all it's done is made my belly very big. There's no trace of another person to be found. Versus this, it's almost this undeniable example of gainer fetishism, this idea of I have consumed so much to the point where my own body gives way. We talk about that sliding scale. I wonder if the kind of popping of buttons, bursting of seams, the belt snapping, pants ripping, if that is almost the precursor. Because that's the sort of
yeah, that's a sort of
the
psychological psychosocial edging.
yeah.
It's like we're edging you up to the point where, and I know that people that I've spoken to over the years that are into the exploding thing, to them the explosion is kind of like the orgasm.
Yeah, it makes sense that when the clothes give way, each article that kind of rips or tears or pops or flies off, that's sort of like the false finish. Like, oh no, no, still more to go, still more to go. We're still growing. So it makes sense to me that a character like Mr. Creosote really represents like indulgence for a lot of gainers. And while his approach to consumption may not have been very ladylike, so to say, I wonder if gainers who kind of have that Dionysus edge, They love the luxury. They love the chugging of champagne while wearing, jewelry and rings on every finger. I wonder if that also kind of stems a little bit from Mr. Creosote, because he represents the gourmand who, dressed in his finery, still wants to eat and eat and eat and just,
I
mindless.
would agree with that. Yeah, I would think that that has some definite influence there.
So, I think it's really interesting to just to explore how all of those elements kind of come together. Now, I do want to say, I think it's interesting you mentioned that, the humor in the film, it's different to what you see in America. And in fairness, I don't think you could recreate it today,
Mm-mm.
modern sensibilities. So, do you think that the evolution of humor, like, is humor evolving towards a more inclusive narrative? Or do you think it's more like you wouldn't find someone who wants to try and recreate a Monty Python?
I don't think you'll find somebody who wants to recreate it, but I think you'll find plenty of people like we've talked about in other examples since the film of trying to emulate it or call back to it or pay homage to it, because there are plenty of filmmakers and writers who have seen it, and I'm sure that they can work it into something. The weird part is that it's probably going to work its way into a children's show somewhere. Because these things inevitably wind up in children's media. How many examples did we list when we did our episode on cartoons of the 90s and how like those had profound influences on us? I think as far in terms of whether it's going to be a more inclusive narrative, I honestly don't know, because I don't think that you would want to intentionally write a scene into a film like this centered around any kind of body positivity, because it's kind of like the antithesis of body positivity. It's like your gluttony is leading to your ultimate demise. I think that this is something that has to sort of exist only in the realm of kink.
When I think about this scene, I think if you look at it just from more the start to the finish, all the other little bits, it is a French restaurant, which is why everyone's very fancy. I mean, I think the musician who's in the restaurant, he's singing a song about having a penis and being very happy about it.
Oh yeah, it was Eric Idle. He was singing Isn't it awfully nice to have a penis? Isn't it perfectly nice to have a dong? Well, I don't remember the lyrics, but yeah, the song was about having a dick.
Absolutely ridiculous.
Well, and that's it. That was their trademark, absurdist humor. Like, sorry to segue here, but one of my favorite, like, funny moments from that skit is before, no, Mr. Creosote has just sat down. He's thrown up into the bucket. He's thrown up on the woman trying to clean up the throw up. And there's this one couple that gets up and they're like, oh no, we have to go. We have to be sat somewhere else. Or no, we have to leave the restaurant. And the maitre d' is like, why does Madame et Monsieur want to leave? And she's like, well, I'm having a rather heavy period. So
It's very, very. If you remember, after he explodes and all the diners, it's sort of. Some people didn't even move. Some people got splattered on and just continued to lift soup to mouth, kept eating.
Mhm.
And in the process of cleaning, the woman who's doing it proposes that life is meaningless, and then reveals that she's a massive racist. So it's like that absurdist humor, I almost think, is the gateway to where a lot of this kind of emerges from. I mean, again, we mentioned Blueberry with Violet Beauregard. It's very absurd. Roald Dahl iconography and ideology, very absurdist. These fantastical situations in which things occur. And, you know, I think it's interesting to kind of reference back to a time in the world where you could really, not to say get away, but you could get away with this wild imagery that just has an effect and probably affected people in ways that people wouldn't have suspected.
Yeah.
Like when we
I
did.
mean, at the time that the film came out, it was the early 80s. And the 80s, I swear, the 80s were such a golden age for both practical effects and absurd shit in films. Like, this was the era of like extreme high fantasy and extremely raunchy comedy and like extreme melodrama. It was like everything in the 80s was just amped up to an 11, no matter what the movie was.
Yeah. I just think it's really interesting to reflect on where it all kind of comes from. And it does come from this melding pot of just all sorts, bits and pieces all throughout. So I want to ask you this, because obviously you and I have acknowledged we're not gut explosion people, but we can sense an appreciation. We can get a sense of, you know what? this is maybe my on-ramp with the popping of buttons, with these
Mhm.
elements of the fetish.
Oh yeah, I can totally get behind that. Like if they want to do that in future films, just make draw it out a bit longer. Don't make the explosion happen within a couple of seconds. Give us a few more stages to work with because I can deal with everything right up until the guts go flying everywhere. But I don't know if they will include that kind of thing in a major film anymore, unless it is like meant to be a really raunchy, stupid comedy, or if it's supposed to be like a parody film. I
Like,
don't, because they were absurdists, right? So that kind of thing doesn't really work with 2023 audiences. Um, it would have to be something that was intentionally quirky, weird, or like nostalgic for that to wind up in a film.
yeah, I feel like I'd love to see more examples of that kind of more visceral element of gaining, the guy who stuffs himself and you can almost hear the creaking. And maybe you don't know immediately what that sound is, but you sort of hear that little sound of seams beginning to split and, you know?
The mayor from A Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. I mean,
Oh,
he never explodes, but there's a great example of like that you can show us more of that. Like for those of us that aren't into if you guys are into exploding bellies, then by all means, I hope that they put more of that into media eventually. But like, if they feel that they can't, then they can give us the other side of the coin. They can give us, more of the mayor from Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs.
yeah, I think more explosion that maybe gives the lead up to. And if there is an inclusion of popping and exploding, however it manifests, I'd like to see more of that kind of slow build into something that really allows you to sort of indulge in someone's growth.
Mhm.
I'd love to see a storyline about a character who gets bigger over the course of the season. And maybe the only way to do that realistically is with a fat suit, and I know that's a little bit touch
Yeah.
and go. But if you did that as part of a porn series, let's say, I
Oh
think it's
yeah.
very sexy to see a character get bigger over a series of films, perhaps. Slowly but
I
surely.
mean, if you're into all of that, plus sometimes it includes bursting, not always, but throughout the course of a video, go look up anything by Taylor Made Clips. I
Boom.
mean, that's her whole bread and butter.
Literally go do that. I realized I said boom. That's very boom. That's it. It's on brand. But there you go. There you go, guys. I think that's a fair exploration of the film. And listen, I know he only encompasses that one scene, but I feel like everyone knows about Mr. Creosote. Everyone
Yeah.
remembers that visceral visual scene, and
Well,
he
it's amazing how only one scene in a film can have that much impact that it is parodied, paid homage to, sometimes ripped off completely in other things. One thing that I think is really interesting about the actor who played Mr. Creosote,
Terry.
that's not was that his name Terry Gilliam? That is not the first time that he's been in a such like in when they had the show, when they had the Monty Python Flying Circus show, he
Mhm.
did a skit where he got blown up like a balloon, like his whole body inflated like a balloon and he floated away.
Terry Gilliam, despite being not a fat person, has played many fat characters across those
He
six.
has.
Because my mind actually goes to the first thing I would have seen when I was a child, because I did Wind in the Willows. And he, of course, played Mr. Toad. Oh, hello! Hooray! Splendid! Picnic on the river! Like, very that fantasy. So, very interesting. I wonder if there's something to this. Terry Gilliam, if you're listening, feel free to come on, talk to us. That'd be
Oh,
fabulous.
wait a minute. Is it Terry Gilliam or Terry Gilliam? Because Terry Gilliam is an author, right?
Oh, now you got me questioning myself. I always thought it was Terry Gilliam. Hang on. British filmmaker Terry Gilliam. Sorry.
Gilliam. Okay, so then isn't there also no, I'm thinking Terry Pratchett. I'm sorry. I'm thinking Terry Pratchett.
Oh,
Never mind.
right. Okay. Terry Gilliam.
I'm sorry.
Right, I see. Trying to cause deception.
No, the Terrys, like that's where I got confused. I was like, wait a minute, I thought he was the guy who wrote Discworld.
No, no, that's Terry Pratchett, who is unfortunately no longer with us.
Yes.
But Terry Gilliam. Oh, excuse me. Excuse me. Would Sir like a thin mint?
It's would Sir like a waffle mint, a
Okay.
waffle thin mint,
Oh,
a bucket for Monsieur.
Blah. We're going to need another bucket. But again, I think that's very camp, and what an iconic character. And, you know, upon reflection, to think that maybe that is the sort of impetus for that kind of Dionysus brand of gaming, as well as explosion fetishists and inflation and all those other things, that it really has that kind of shared root. So, how fabulous. How wonderful. How
The
interesting.
roots go deep. The roots always go deep.
Roots are strong, my lord. They go deep. Quoting that one orc from the Lord of the Rings there.
I know you've been watching too much Rings of Power.
Too much Rings of Power, sis. Too much of it, honestly. Wipe out thin ring of power. Now I'm crossbreeding Monty Python's The Meaning of Life with Rings of Power. That's not. Monty Python's The Meaning of the Silmarillion, where Galadriel was fattening up Elrond.
But just to see John Cleese back on the screen and you know, maybe playing a really silly elf, that would be funny.
Would Monsieur do like a little waffle thin? Well, actually, I don't know what any of the Elvish food was called, so we can't go.
Lemnis bread is the only one that I know of.
Would Monsieur like a waffle thin lemon bread? Christ. Okay, no, we're diving off the deep end here, which I think means it's time to wrap up this episode. Tim, did you have any final thoughts?
No. I mean, again, I hope that everyone who listened doesn't think that we're vehemently against exploding, but even though it might not be our thing, like, this definitely had an effect on both of us and has had an effect on pretty much every gamer that's ever seen it. So
I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's no way to reference this film without some form of reverence, really. And look, that's why we're celebrating these films in particular, because they fucking did something in the zeitgeist. They are the inception of sexuality and fetish for many of us, and for those of us who grew up watching these things, they could have very well been the impetus for when and where and why these fascinations emerged, you know? So we always do it with love, you know? So listen, if any of you, as we asked before, are explosion enthusiasts who want to come on and talk us through your mentality and thought process and all the other bits and pieces that go along with it, reach out to us at thiccradio@gmail.com. But that's a wrap for now here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. If you liked this episode, the podcast, or just us in general, share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BeefyFrat at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, and BeefyFrat at ThiccyMouse. You can also look us up on TikTok at Thicc Radio or at our website at www.podpage.com/Thicc Radio. If you want to submit a voice note, you can reach us at anchor.fm/Thicc Radio/message. And if you have any questions or ideas for episodes, you can reach us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Patreon and Anchor app podcast produced by Stannnum and Thicky Mouse.
Mixed and mastered by stannnum.
Our artwork is provided by Lokitu.
Our theme song is provided by Spotify Cream.